What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Simon Rochford. I'm a headshot and portrait photographer based in Vancouver, BC, and let's talk about photography. Today I'm starting a short series of videos about the basics of photography, taking you all the way back to the beginning so that you can get out of auto mode and get shooting in manual and create some awesome pictures. Being stuck in auto mode can suck. It can be really frustrating. I know, I've been there. The first time I picked up a DSLR camera was over 10 years ago, and I had no idea what I was doing, and it took a long time of either trial and error, YouTube videos like this, or other things to be able to be more comfortable and figure things out. What we're going to cover today is what's called the exposure triangle. That's the mixture of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Understanding the exposure triangle is vital to be able to create awesome pictures, and we're going to go over each of these today. First of all, aperture. What is it? Well, I have an older lens off of a Aperture GX1 right here to show, but the aperture is actually the small blade in the lens that you can see here that goes wider and goes narrower. Now, when you have a wide aperture, that lets in tons of light in through the lens and onto the sensor. That makes the image bright. Therefore, when you have a much narrower aperture, that results in much less light coming through and the image being darker. There's less light hitting the sensor. So when looking to buy a lens, you can see how wide the aperture can go by looking on the side of it and seeing what the f-stop says. When looking at, say, the Canon 50mm, you can get three types. You can get the f1.2, the f1.4, and the f1.8. So the f1.2 will let in much more light than the f1.8. And then, for example, the camera and lens that I'm shooting with just now, the camera's a 70D, the lens is a 16-35 f4, and that will let in at its widest aperture a lot less light than, say, the Canon 50mm f1.2. So that's something to keep in mind. Usually most kit lenses have the lowest f-stop rating of around about f3.5, f5.6, which is significantly lower than f1.2, but it's something to keep in mind when you're looking at cameras and lenses, that's what it means. So shooting at a wider aperture doesn't only let in loads of light. What it does is it results in a very shallow depth of field. That's when you get that isolated subject. The person in your image is really sharp, but the background is all blurry. You might get a bit of bokeh in the background. That's a result of having the aperture wide open. So if you want to have a portrait that really pops, that's a great way to do it. Great use of a wide aperture. Narrower aperture results in a much larger depth of field. So that means that everything is generally in focus. This is fantastic for landscape photography, for real estate photography, when you want everything to be sharp and crisp. The only thing is that you're going to have to make sure that you make up for the lack of light that's coming in through that tiny aperture. So when it comes to shutter speed, it's talking about how long the shutter is open, and in that time how much light is touching the sensor. So with my camera just here, there's a quick example. There's that at 1/50th of a second, and then at 1,000th of a second, it's much quicker. So when that shutter is open, the light is hitting the sensor, and the longer that it's open, the brighter the image is going to be. The quicker the shutter speed means the less light that's going to come through. Now, the shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds. As I had before, I had one shot taken at 1/50th of a second, and then another couple of images shot at 1/1000th of a second. So a lot less light is going to come through at 1/1000th of a second than at 1/50th. Shutter speed doesn't only affect the amount of light hitting the sensor, it also affects motion blur. You're going to get a lot more blur if you're shooting at a much slower shutter speed than at a quicker shutter speed. And this is usually when people start to complain that their photos look blurry. That's usually when you're shooting in auto, where your camera is trying to get the best exposed image possible, and a lot of the time it just lowers that shutter speed way too down so that it can get a perfectly exposed image. Auto mode might put it down to, say, 1/30th of a second, which is just going to be far too blurry. But on the other hand, if you put it into manual mode and put it up to around 125th of a second, it's going to be a lot sharper, but then the amount of light coming in is going to be less and the image is going to be a bit darker. Having said that, that is something you can probably deal with in post. And also the next thing we're going to talk about is ISO. So what is ISO? Well, this is not Craigslist. It does not stand for in search of. It actually stands for the International Organization of Standardization. I've got it written down here, so I did not memorize that. So that's the main governing body that standardizes the sensitivity ratings for cameras. So on a lot of cameras, your ISO is going to be starting at about 100 and can go up to 1600, 3200, 6400, and even some cameras can go way, way past that and can be very, very sensitive. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive the sensor is to light. So if you have a lower ISO, it's not going to be that sensitive, but the image is going to be really, really crisp. If you bump it up all the way to say 6400 plus, depending on which camera, you're gonna get a grainier image because it's much more sensitive. So that is the downside of having a higher ISO, is that you're gonna then get digital noise. I had a situation years ago when I was doing a shoot and I had the ISO up way too high for quite a few images. The images looked good, they were framed nicely, but they were just too grainy to be usable. And that was a mistake on my part. That was just, a learning process, and good thing was that it was just, you're just shooting with friends and you're figuring things out. So the best thing to do is test out the ISO on your camera at home, or just test it out with friends. You can pump the ISO up and keep going with it to the highest possible point that you're happy with. It's not going to end up grainy. Don't rely on the back of the camera to make that judgment. Get it on your computer. Take a look at it properly, otherwise you will have the shock of your life later on. Trust me. But the most important thing is just to practice and have fun with it. Have fun with manipulating these different things. You've got ISO, aperture, shutter speed. You can play around with them. You can figure out what works. Once you figure out the rules, you can then have the best fun by completely breaking them and having good fun with it, which we'll talk about later on in this series. I hope you found this information useful. Leave a like, leave a comment, smash that subscribe button, that would be awesome, and I will see you in the next video. See ya.